We are now on part 16 of our respectful rebuttal of Richard Gage's 9/11 video, Blueprint for Truth. Richard Gage showed a series of compelling eyewitness accounts around both the Twin Towers and Building 7. We will ask ourselves if these accounts from eyewitnesses to the Building 7 collapse are evidence of bombs or just kinds of explosions that one would expect to hear in a major fire. We will also look at Richard's evidence that people knew in advance that Building 7 was going to fall and add some testimony of our own. So let's begin with the eyewitness accounts of explosions in Building 7. The problem with eyewitness accounts is that unlike the laws of physics, the accounts can change. 6 years after 9/11, a few weeks after an email hoax in 2007 to Dylan Avery about a Building 7 countdown, first responder and 9/11 hero Kevin McHatton came forth to say that vets, quote, got a vibe that Building 7 was coming down. There was something he couldn't exactly hear that sounded like a countdown. And in the last few seconds, they looked at him weird as if to say, run for your life. Here is Kevin talking at a 9/11 meeting in 2007.
And a couple of vets that were there, they got the vibe that something was coming down. And we started asking questions, everybody started asking questions, and then next thing you know, there were the Red Cross representatives pacing back and forth in front of the crowd, holding his hand over the radio. And I couldn't hear what it was saying, but it was like, it was pulsed. Whatever the speech was on there was pulsed, and that means to me it was most likely a countdown. But he took his hand off at the last 3 seconds, and he gave this like heartfelt look, like he didn't look, just run for your life.
A few months later, he changed his story, claiming he heard someone say they are bringing the building down. And this time he asserted that he definitely heard a countdown to 3, 2, 1. And that people said, just run for your life, not just a vibe or a look this time. So here is a very different testimony from Kevin, which he gave and appears in Richard Gage's Blueprint for Truth.
He came back over with his hand over the radio and what sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom!
So which story do you believe? Well, you'll have to decide that for yourself. Another Building 7 eyewitness was Michael Hess, Giuliani's chief lawyer. He and fellow city worker Barry Jennings got caught in Building 7 and barely escaped with their lives. Michael Hess said that he heard and felt the building shake like an earthquake for 5 to 10 seconds prior to the collapse of either tower. But in 2007, he too changed his story, claiming in a BBC interview that he got his timing wrong and that the 10-second long earthquake sound was most likely caused by tower debris hitting the building later in the morning. There were no explosions, he said. That was caused by the north half of number 1 falling onto the southern half of our building, close quote. He compared what he heard to a loud, rumbling earthquake, not the staccato blasts of explosions. Which story do you believe this time? Will you decide based on what you believe about the destruction of Building 7? Barry Jennings, the city emergency coordinator who carries some real credibility, did not change his story. He went to work after hearing that a Cessna had crashed into the World Trade Center, and he headed up to the 23rd floor, arriving at about 10 a.m., shortly after the 9:45 a.m. evacuation cleared the building. The power went out, and he claims he heard explosions before the collapse and broke out a window. The firefighters below ran away, and he said, I had no way of knowing why they ran. He testified that one tower was still standing at that time. Hearing explosions prior to the collapse of the towers is serious evidence for bombs at Building 7. It directly contradicts the revised testimony of Michael Hess, and unlike Hess, Jennings stuck with his story. He then got so many phone calls from 9/11 activists at his job that he was afraid he would be fired. He died in 2008, and the cause of death was revealed only to his next of kin, as state law in New York or New Jersey requires. So we are now left with a credible witness whose testimony is directly contradicted by the only person who could have corroborated his story. There is video of Jennings waving his arms out an 8th-story window, but no time is attached to that videotape, so it's impossible to use it to confirm his time frame. Barry Jennings lays it out in his testimony, and one 9/11 Truth activist told me that eyewitness testimony is valuable when you can see a pattern of testimony, not just one person. And yet he also thinks Barry Jennings' individual testimony carries a high degree of credibility, even though he is one individual. Was Jennings' account accurate, or was he confused by the time frame? Did the angle that he was looking at the towers from, plus all the dust and the chaos, distort his perceptions of which towers were standing and which had fallen? Or did his training in emergency management make him a more professional and clear-headed witness than the average person? Does Michael Hess have more or less credibility than Barry Jennings? Whom do you believe this time? Barry Jennings died in 2008. There is suspicion around his death among many in the 9/11 Truth movement. I have some relevant life experience that most people don't have in this part of the world. In my work, I've sat across from over 200 grieving families, helping them prepare funerals and memorial services. I've talked with families of the deceased. Sometimes these people have had post-traumatic stress disorder from a war. They either drank themselves to death, they had a drug overdose, committed suicide, or otherwise died in ways that the family occasionally doesn't want to reveal. Sometimes families keep the cause of death secret even for a simple heart attack, or perhaps to push away public brouhaha in time of grief. In most states, the next of kin has a right to privacy, and the cause of death is not released to anyone else. 9/11 activist Dylan Avery believed the death was suspicious and hired a private investigator to find Jennings' cause of death. Considering the anguish of the grieving families I've witnessed firsthand, I consider that unethical. The private investigator looked into the case a bit. He came back to Dylan Avery, and he said he was dropping the investigation. So I called the PI myself and asked why that might have happened. I was told that PIs back off to avoid criminal or civil liability. Barry Jennings' family may have had to go to the expense and the stress of hiring a lawyer to chase Dylan Avery's private investigator away during one of the most difficult times of their lives. I beg all 9/11 Truth activists to please respect the privacy of a grieving family and show compassion for their situation. Richard Gage also talks about foreknowledge of the destruction of Building 7. Kevin Paddington's changing countdown testimony is one example. The BBC and other news outlets reporting on the destruction of Building 7 prior to its collapse is another. World Trade Center 7's collapse was indeed anticipated for several hours, and the building had been evacuated. Now, I've been a classical music radio announcer for over 30 years, and I've been surrounded by journalists since 1979. I was stunned that BBC's journalistic error became grounds for suspicion of the official 9/11 story. But apparently the story of BBC reporter Jane Stanley announcing the collapse of Building 7 before it happened has real traction in the 9/11 Truth community. So I spent a few hours researching what actually happened. Deputy Fire Chief Peter Hayden of the New York Fire Department recalled he had a discussion with one particular engineer there, and we asked him, if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and if so, how soon? And it turned out that he was pretty much right on the money, that he said in its current state you have about 5 hours. Hayden will not reveal the name of this engineer, but he told his story to the BBC in 2008. CNN reported at 11:07 a.m. that Building 7 had collapsed at 10:45, or 15 minutes after the second tower collapsed at around 10:30. CNN got their misinformation from the respected news agency Reuters. On 9/11, reporters also said that Camp David had been hit by a plane. Forbes magazine reported that a car bomb exploded outside the State Department, according to State Department sources. CBS News reported that as many as 8 planes had been hijacked and only 4 have been accounted for. It's not hard to imagine how such mistakes can be made. The media make mistakes, especially when there is no time to sift through and analyze fast-moving information. As NIST reported, the large dust clouds generated by the collapse of World Trade Center 1 hid the lower portions of World Trade Center 7 from view for over 20 minutes following the collapse. So firefighters on the ground saw only dust where Building 7 was until around 10:50 a.m. and may have reported it as having come down. In Richard Gage's presentations and on his Blueprint for Truth video, Richard simply shows the BBC reporter announcing the collapse of Building 7 while the building is standing behind her. Then he gives his standard laugh line. What were they, psychic? Now, I know my explanation was longer, it wasn't funny, it won't get the applause like Richard's line, but when you finish laughing, just think for 1 second, what makes more sense? That the BBC made a Dewey defeats Truman kind of mistake, or that the BBC was somehow let in on the collapse of Building 7? What possible value can there be in telling the media about your secret plan for a false flag operation? The BBC reporter who made that mistake has been repeatedly confronted by 9/11 Truth activists. I think it's past time that she be left alone. There certainly was foreknowledge of collapse on Building 7. All kinds of firefighters have testified to seeing the building losing its structural integrity, And many experienced firefighters predicted its collapse just by looking at the way the structure was bulging. The top fire chief, Daniel Nigro, acted on this observation. Quote, "I feared a collapse at Building 7, as did many on my staff. The collapse of Building 1 damaged portions of the lower floors of 7. Building 7 was built on a small number of large columns, providing an open atrium on the lower levels. Fire on many floors of the World Trade Center 7 burdened without sufficient water supply to attack them. For these reasons, I made the decision, without consulting the owner, the mayor, or anyone else, as ranking fire officer that the decision was my responsibility, to clear a collapse zone surrounding the building and to stop all activity within that zone. Approximately 3 hours after, World Trade Center 7 collapsed. Conspiracy theories abound, and I believe firmly that all of them are without merit." Here is a video of firefighter Miller talking about the impending collapse of Building 7. You can see he knew it was coming down that afternoon.
See where the white smoke is? You see this thing leaning like this? It's definitely coming down. There's no way to stop it. Because you have to go up in there to put it out, and it's already, the structural integrity is not there in the building. It's tough. This is beyond.
The scope of the disaster is unimaginable. The job ahead, seemingly impossible.
You know, we can handle just about everything. This is beyond.
Here's firefighter Tiernock Cassidy. It was fully engulfed, that whole building. There were pieces of Tower 2 and Building 7 and the corners of the building missing. You could see the flames going straight through from one side of the building to another. That's an entire block. Deputy Chief Peter Hayden, we saw the bulge in the southwest corner between floors 10 and 13. We had just put a transit on that, and we were pretty sure she was going to collapse. John Norman, at the edge of the south face, you could see was very, very heavily damaged. Fire Captain Chris Boyle, Butch said, "Forget it, there's creaking or noises coming out of there," so we just stopped. I have more quotes like this, but you get the idea. A whole bunch of firefighters and engineers had foreknowledge of the collapse because they could see it was about to happen with their own eyes. At 5:20 p.m., Building 7 finally falls. There's a stampede over pickaxes and oxygen tanks. They head out toward the crushed fire trucks. Quote, "They're looking for their brothers," close quote, says an ambulance driver. Firefighters had just lost hundreds of their brothers and weren't thinking about Richard Gage's mantra that no tall steel structure ever collapsed due to fire. All of these firefighters and more said they saw structural buckling just like any other building about to go down. There was definitely foreknowledge of Building 7 destruction. The firefighters whose lives depended on knowing these things predicted it. I sometimes wish everyone interested in what happened on 9/11 could talk to some of the eyewitnesses on the ground. For example, one of my friends is a library consultant and has talked with Pentagon librarians who were baffled by claims of some 9/11 truth people that no plane ever hit the Pentagon. How can they say that, they asked, when we were here, and not only did we see the plane, it almost killed us. Here's another mistake any eyewitness could have corrected. For years, this photo of firefighters supposedly working around molten steel was shown in 9/11 videos and presentations around the country. The FDNY firefighters themselves could have told anyone that they weren't putting their faces and boots into the molten steel. Now, to Richard Gage's credit, he long ago stopped using this photo as evidence of molten steel and debris. But I saw this used by a 9/11 researcher in a lecture as recently as 2010. So since it remains in use and is part of the collective memory of the 9/11 truth movement, I think it worthwhile to show you that the video this picture came from proves that the firefighters were using a strong flashlight. We are at 214 reasons for natural collapse and counting. The countdown begins toward our last major section, an explanation of the free fall collapse of the north perimeter wall of Building 7. Maybe even slightly faster than free fall, as we will see. But before that, we're going to ask the most obvious question. The first question most people ask when confronted with this controlled demolition theory. How could people have secretly gotten all those bombs into the buildings in the first place? Well, you guessed it. Richard Gage thinks it can be done, and I don't. Thanks for hanging in there all this time.